The Rakshasa's Great Katana is one of the interesting great katanas in the game and is known for its killer skill which can deal tons of damage. Because of its exceptional properties, it earned the name Oceans of Blood. I am the Samurai and today we will be visiting my new Rakshasa Samurai build, the Bloodlust Samurai. I will be covering its playstyle, what equipment to use, the best talismans for this build, along with useful gameplay tips and more. So if you are looking for an effective build for this great katana, this video is for you. The Bloodlust Samurai heavily relies on the power of the Rakshasa's great katana and performs violent wide cleaving swings which can deal tons of raw damage. Taking down multiple targets or bursting down bosses is the specialty of this build. Each swing packs a punch and enemies will also suffer bleed procs in the process, making this build even more powerful. Compared to the previous Rakshasa build that I made, the Bloodlust Samurai is even deadlier since I loaded it up with another broken weapon and gives the build the ability to deal with ranged attacks for more versatility. Additionally, this build can tank damage while it trades blows with enemies, as the Bloodlust Samurai has decent damage negation stats, life steals, and hyper armor capabilities. If you want a simple yet powerful build to play, this setup is for you. Build playstyle is out of the way, let's start this guide by tackling the Bloodlust Samurai stats. Note that I will be standardizing all of my builds around level 200, and it is up to you if you wish to level up the build past around this level. Starting with Vigor first, and I have 50 Vigor points as this build usually trades blows with enemies, and I can easily see that 60 points is still a good choice for this build. You are still going to dodge frequently, so I think 50 points is the sweet spot here. Next is Mind, and 25 points were allocated to it. The FP usage of this build is not really that demanding, so I think 25 points will do the job. Endurance is next, and I have 30 points allocated to it, and your main skill for this build eats a lot of stamina on the other hand, but I find 30 points works really well in most cases. While 24 points were allocated to Strength to gain an additional attack rating. Next on the list is Dexterity, and 75 points have been allocated to it since it is our main stat for this build. Intelligence wise, no points were allotted to it since it's not needed for this build. Next is Fate, is 25 points were allotted to Fate so you can access attack and defense boosting incantations so we can increase the build's offensive and defensive capabilities. Lastly is Arcane, and 40 points were allotted to it. We will be using another weapon that scales to Arcane later on to deal with effective ranged attacks. Stats are out of the way, let's move on to the Bloodlust Samurai's equipment. And as usual, all of the item locations will be linked in the description section below, along with a build showcase, so stay tuned for that as well. With that out of the way, let's start with the build's main weapon, which is the mentioned Rakshasa's Great Katana. This Great Katana requires 12 strength, 27 dexterity, and no arcane scaling, which I really wish this weapon should have, and has a D scaling for strength and B for dexterity. Not only does the Rakshasa's Great Katana hit really hard and look really awesome, but the star of the show, or the skill that makes this build stand out, is the Weed Cutter skill. A skill that literally cuts targets horizontally and deletes them like weeds. You will be cutting a lot of enemies like weeds, so it does match the skill's name. Pressing L2 once will let the user perform 2 wide arcing slashes and can be extended as long they have stamina and FP. Each skill usage only costs 8 FP, which is totally insane. Moving on to the pros of this weapon, and aside from its skill cheap's FP cost, the Weed Cutter skill hits like a truck per swing and you will see huge numbers in seconds. Also, these numbers can easily skyrocket due to the bleed procs. Additionally, the user will be granted hyper armor while in the middle of its animation, allowing the user to withstand or face roll normal attacks. While it sounds OP because the weapon is really OP in my opinion, however, like any other weapons, there are negatives as well. While having hyper armor is good, the user will also receive more damage in the process, but we do have a workaround for this later on. This skill's hyper armor can withstand most of the attacks in the game, but surely the bigger attacks can still cancel the Weed Cutter animation, which is not a good thing. The Weed Cutter's animation is super slow in my opinion, making you super open for attacks if used carelessly. Moving on to the build's secondary weapon, and I suggest using Dragon Communion Seal to match the build's theme and for us to have access to the key buffs that we will be using later on. While assessing the previous Rakshasa build that I made in the past, I noticed that it lacks versatility in combat, so I decided to equip Reduvia as the main range damage dealing weapon for this build. Although you can use this weapon in melee range to deal tons and tons of damage, maybe it's even more deadlier than the Rakshasa itself, we will only be using its range skill, the Reduvia Bloodblade. This will damage bosses when they are unreachable or when in the middle of special attack animations, like AoE Blast and the like. The Reduvia Bloodblade can easily ramp up your Bloodlust build-up, and not to mention, this weapon matches the theme perfectly. Weapons are out of the way, let's move on to my suggested spells. I mentioned that we'll be accessing buffs when using this build. The first on the list is Flame Grant Me Strength Incantation for an additional 20% physical attack boost and stamina recovery buff. The second buff on the list is of course Golden Vow. This buff increases overall damage by 15% and adds 10% damage negation, which is very helpful for this build. But before anything else, only 6% of you who watch the channel regularly are subscribed, so help the channel by subscribing today, and it's free anyway, and I will thank you forever. If you can hit that like button as well, it will surely help me a lot. Join our Discord server as well, and we are building an empire where you can find like-minded people who love the same genre. Now back into the video. Weapons are out of the way, moving on to my suggested talismans. The first talisman on the list is our staple Shard of Alexander. This provides a 15% skill damage increase, especially when performing the Weed Cutter skill. Highly recommended, so be sure to slot this one. Since we can easily proc bleeds when using the Reduvia or when in the middle of the Weed Cutter skill, I suggest slotting Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and these talismans will provide another 20% attack power if Bloodlust procs near the user. Of course, we are dealing with speedy multi-hitting attacks, slotting in Rotting Wing Sword Insignia is suggested for this build. You will be swinging and hitting enemies frequently, so the attack boost from this talisman will take effect easily. You will be trading blows with enemies or tank incoming damage when doing the Weed Cutter skill, so I suggest slotting Dragon Crest Great Shield for the additional 20% physical damage negation it provides, and it will increase your overall survivability. Moving on to my Great Runes, on the other hand, Godric's Great Rune is usually my best choice in all of my builds, since I do love additional stats it provides. However, for this build, once you get a hold of Malenia's Great Rune, it is the top pick for the Bloodlust Samurai, as this rune adds lifesteal to your attacks. This rune alone can help you regain lost health and circumvent the damage you received thanks to this rune's lifesteal capability. Now that the main equipment is out of the way, let's move on to the Bloodlust Samurai's armor set. For this build, I am wearing one of my favorite sets in the game, which is the Rakshasa set. And man, it does look great and looks sick in every way. I just changed the helmet to my usual Land of Reeds helm to preserve the build's identity. This is just me though, and you can wear anything you want. Really happy with how it turned out, as it matches the build's theme pretty well. Moving on to my Flash of Wonders physique combination, since this build heavily relies on multi-hitting attacks, I highly suggest using Thorny Crag tier for further increase of damage, and pairing with Opaline Heart tier for more damage negation. Now that equipment and spells are out of the way, let's move on to the Bloodlust Samurai's gameplay and optimization tips. These tips will help you master this build. The first tip that I have for you is to optimize your opener. When the battle starts, what I usually do is casting Golden Vow to deal more damage and damage reduction, and next is Flame Grant Me Strength. And then use my Flash of Wonders physique lastly to make consecutive attacks stronger and for more damage negation. Then rush into the boss and start performing the Weed Cutter skill, and during this time, try your best to deal with as many attacks as you can, since the attack buff from this physique won't last. You will be dealing tons of damage in the process. The second tip on the list is managing Weed Cutter wisely. After spending time using this build, you will be able to determine when to face roll incoming attacks versus dodging them completely. So when you can tank attacks, just use Weed Cutter till the enemy dies. However, if you need to dodge because an attack can kill you like in 2 to 3 shots, performing the Weed Cutter once can give you a wiggle room to dodge afterwards. But if you notice that you are fighting a super fast enemy, don't push the Weed Cutter skill and stick to the two-handed normal attacks. Tip number 3 is you can replace Lord of Blood's Exaltations with two-handed Talisman if the enemy doesn't bleed. This will make your two-handed attacks stronger. Crusade Insignia is a good pickup as well if you are exploring, as you can maintain its attack buff requirement pretty easily. The next tip is about using Reduvia effectively. I mentioned that this is going to be your main range weapon, and use this when the boss is doing an AoE attack and you can get near it. But you can also utilize Reduvia as your main Bloodlust ramping tool. You can do so by firing 2 to 3 shots of its blood blade before closing in into the target before spamming the weed cutter skill. In this way, you will be proccing bleed much faster and enjoy the buff for the Lord of Blood's Exhortation Talisman. I simply love the simplicity of this build and more Samurai builds coming, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Comment down below what are the things that you've learned from this video and give it a like to support the channel. If you want to master dark powers or harness the immense power of the stars, these build videos are for you. Thank you for watching and I will catch you on the next one.